Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. As always, we thank you for listening, and I'm going to jump right into the topic and the guest today. Joining me, we have two members of the Coker team. We have Alex Kirkland, who's been on before, and we have Matt Jensen, who I believe is your first time, Matt, but we appreciate you guys jumping on with us, have a brief conversation about something that is a topic that we've actually talked about and written about now a good bit, but it's something that continues to be very much on the top of minds of our clients and our audience out there with questions and needs related to how they can deal with it. And so what we're talking about is the update and continued changes in E&M coding requirements and some of the values associated with the coding practices. And so it affects obviously every healthcare provider and provider organization out there. And we're talking about stuff that originally went into effect January of 2021. And now as we record this in February of 2022, there has been some additional changes and developments and things that affect the previous updates. And so we're going to get into that, but also just kind of talk about how this affects these organizations that we're working with. Before we jump in, I do want to put in a plug, and you'll hear us talk about this throughout our conversation today. But back in 21, Coker developed a tool for anyone out there. Find it for free on our website at cokergroup.com. But it's a calculator, and it's an automated tool that allows an individual or an organization to go in, enter some information, and get an idea, a better understanding of how these coding requirement and changes could ultimately affect their own organization. So it's something that we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. I think it's very helpful. It's very simple, and it may kind of only graze the surface as far as getting into the full effects of these changes for an individual entity. But I think it's something that is absolutely a good place to start if you're wondering what do these changes mean? What do we do about it? How is it going to affect us? How do we plan for this? And then that's something we regularly work with our clients on as well. So if folks do have questions, I would encourage you all to go check that out. Again, you can find that at cokergroup.com. Or reach out to any of our guests today and feel free to ask them questions. But with that, I want to jump into the conversation. And Alex, if you don't mind, give us some context and background as to what are we actually talking about and how we got here to where we're at today.
Thanks, Mark. This is pretty big news. And so everybody's heard to some degree what CMS did. The Cliff Notes version is that CMS is increasing the number of RVUs that they're reimbursing for, predominantly associated with outpatient E&M services. And so because they reimburse on an RVU basis, and they have to be cognizant of their overall spend, budget neutrality constraints, things like that, it means that in order for them to reimburse for those new RVUs or those additional RVU values, they have to cut their overall conversion factor, which is the amount that they reimburse for every service. And so it's really their point in doing this is they're trying to redirect reimbursement towards cognitive related specialties that are spending more time with those outpatient evaluation and management services. And in order to fund it, it's going to be a little bit at the proceduralist expense, at hospital-based services expense, because we're not seeing very much movement associated with the RVUs within those services. And so it's really created some disruption because E&M codes create such a large portion of work RVUs generated by a multi-specialty medical group. And so these new work RVUs, if you don't revalue your rates per work RVU, consistent with in the same vein that CMS revalued their conversion factor, then you're going to have detached economics within your physician compensation plan that could even cause regulatory concern.
So we know the initial changes started last year with additional events and developments continuing to make some or require some adjustments. How have organizations responded to these changes? I mean, is everybody on the new schedule, if you will?
Far from it. What we're seeing is that there have been organizations that have moved to the new work RVU values, and a lot of organizations that have elected to remain on the old values. Historically, best practice has been within physician contracts or agreements or whatever the case may be. There's language that supports that they will credit work RVUs upon the latest Medicare fee schedule. But now that has created some concern within organizations. We got to have a plan in order to credit these new work RVUs. And so organizations have thought through, how can we remain on those old values? How do we get on the new values? We're seeing a mixed bag of that. Even though the organizations that have moved to the new work RVU values, they may not have revalued their rates per work RVUs. And so that's an ongoing area of concern on now, if you're just awarding 20% more work RVUs to your physicians, but you're paying for the same level of work, but you're paying the legacy rate per work RVU, then physicians are receiving a huge bump for what should be a temporary basis. It's not going to be financially sustainable because there's not the collections to support that. There's incremental collections associated with the E&M codes, but you'll see other services see a decrease. So all in all, there's a balance of dollars, and so there's not the reimbursement. So organizations are still trying to figure out how to incorporate that. And meanwhile, there's been the conversion factor has bounced around a little bit over the past few years, from some stimulus dollars to now we've got a 22 number, and there's other considerations to be mindful of, including what happens with sequestration and other factors.
Something you said kind of makes me want to get more clarification on this conversion factor thing, because every year, right, there's a new fee schedule, Medicare releases, and those things are updated each year. But these changes are certainly more significant, and tying to the conversion factor, that's a different thing. I mean, obviously it's connected, but just walk us through that. I mean, how does this compare from a change standpoint to the regular update of the fee schedule?
Sure. So every year there are changes here and there in the fee schedule. So, for example, the current 22 fee schedule has over 17,300 CPT codes in it. Of those, 300 or so are new this year, and from last year, 135 codes were removed. Those are primarily temporary codes or emerging technology codes that kind of switch in and out. So there are some changes in the codes. There are changes in how malpractice RVUs and practice expense RVUs are calculated every year. So there are minor changes here and there just every year. The big change that occurred in 21, of course, was around the work RVU values for the outpatient E&M codes, and then the conversion factor being expected to drop significantly in response to that. Now, as Alex mentioned, we've had stimulus last year, and then this year as well. There was expected to be a 3.75% cut to the conversion factor again. That Congress in December passed a bill to remove the payment cut there and increase payment. In addition, something that wasn't as top of mind for a lot of people that kind of snuck in there was about sequestration. There were actually two different sequestration cuts that were expected to go into effect in January of this year. One was 2% across the board sequester, and that has been removed for the first quarter of 2022. though we will see a 1% cut in the second quarter of 2022, and then the full 2% will actually go into effect for the second half of this year. So that is something that's still out there that folks should be aware of.
Just to clarify, so in addition to the decrease in conversion factor, you're also seeing cuts in the sequestration?
That's correct.
We've seen some mitigating factors that have alleviated some of the planned cuts to the conversion factor. Stimulus dollars were put in place. They've kind of extended some of that perspective, and so they're actually trying to mitigate that. And that's really what's catching the news headlines and what's on everybody's radar. Meanwhile, these other cuts that are sequestration related, not so much on people's radars. And so, even though there's been some mitigation, you're still going to see some disruption in Medicare reimbursement. What I find interesting is if we see that there was a stimulus package passed in 21, we've seen some of that extended now into 2022. It starts to you start to think about corollaries for how Congress dealt with the doc fix bill for so many years under sustainable growth rate. And every year at the 11th hour, they would come through and they would suspend any planned cuts that were expected to take place. We have seen some cuts to the conversion factor, but I wonder if they're going to be using some of these other mechanisms to effectuate some of these cuts, like we're seeing with sequestration, or if there's going to be, just some ongoing at the 11th hour suspending these cuts. And so it's really, trying to get clear direction from Washington, what's going to end up happening with the overall Medicare reimbursement.
Yeah, and that was a point that I was going to make here with, tying the sequestration and the conversion factor together a little bit is they've halted some of the sequestration, but really just kicked the can down the road, where it's halted for now, but there's supposed to be larger cuts coming in the 2030s as a result. So, whether that comes through as sequestration or Medicare conversion factor cuts, or if they just continue to kick the can down the road, will be interesting to see.
So I have to think, one of the things we spend a lot of time on in this regard, working with our clients, is understanding the financial impact. Obviously, we can correlate the impact to coding practices, billing and collections, revenue, et cetera, but it's going to trickle down. So I have to think the impact here could be felt pretty directly when it comes to physician compensation, and based on the changes in the values and the changes in the conversion factors being used. Needless to say, there's a lot of physicians out there that could see their compensation impacted by this, or how the plans function. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah. So a lot of organizations, especially employed organizations, are on a work RVU compensation model. But what CMS did not do when they made these changes was consider how physicians are paid. Their goal is to direct reimbursement in a more intentional manner. And so the onus would then be on healthcare organizations on how they distribute those dollars within their physician enterprises or their medical groups. And so in private practice, this kind of just takes care of itself, where they're just kind of getting the reimbursement. It's a revenue minus expense model, mostly speaking. But on these work RVU dynamics, it's now incumbent upon healthcare organizations. How do we revalue that rate per work RVU, reestablish those work RVU thresholds? Because what was a 5,000 work RVU median amounts for internal medicine, we'll say, maybe that's now 6,000 work RVUs is the median, because they're doing the same level of work, but getting more work RVUs for that. And so we've got our compensation calculator on our website, where you can kind of go in and see the impact if you at a E&M code basis, what your volumes historically have been, what's this going to do to reimbursement, but also what is your legacy rate per work RVU? And if you don't change that, you're going to get really very far upside down on your physician compensation plan, because without changing that, what you'll see is that physician compensation will far outpace any incremental collections that you're getting from those E&M codes. And so what we've been doing is working with organizations to understand how do we isolate that work RVU percentage change and the associated collections from it as well. And so we've been doing that by getting CPT level data, independently calculating work RVUs from the old values to the new values. So it's the same utilization, the same volume data set. And just so we can isolate that if things stay constant, this is what the work RVU percentage change would amount to. And then we can apply the old and new conversion factors or anticipated conversion factors, depending on how organizations want to kind of plot their economic strategy or philosophy in that respect. And then, of course, we would segment that impact for Medicare, or if they're in a market where they're seeing commercial payers that are closely tied to Medicare and that are making changes, reflect that within the collection change as well. I do want to comment, though, that kind of broadly speaking, we're seeing kind of private payers kind of hold pat. Mostly organizations are going to be locked into a fee schedule for a period of time. But we're not seeing a whole lot of movement as far as how organizations or private payers are adopting these changes. Some are, but mostly it's kind of a wait and see kind of perspective within the private payer market.
So particular emphasis on Medicare reimbursement here, though I think maybe there's an inherent assumption that as commercial payers are updating their fee schedules with the providers, they may start to come a little bit closer under this new paradigm.
Yeah, and if I could, just to kind of paint that example a little bit clearer, think about pediatrics. They're not going to have hardly any Medicare business, but their work RVUs are payer agnostic. And so if you're on a work RVU plan, it doesn't matter if you're seeing Medicaid, commercial, self-pay, Medicare, whatever, you're going to get compensated for the level of work effort. Mm-hmm. And so if Medicare is the only payer that's making any collections changes, then think about that on the pediatric side. Now they're going to get rewarded 20% more work RVUs, but there's no additional reimbursement because the other payers are not doing anything differently. And so you've got to revalue that rate per work RVU so that there's a commensurate change in collections that's associated with physician compensation.
What about, we talked a little bit about the financial impact, but talking about the physician comp piece, is there a potential for compliance issues here, specifically related to fair market value?
Absolutely. It's interesting, even without the changes in the E&Ms we've seen over the last several years, the economic divergence between physician compensation and reimbursement, where compensation per work RVUs, the median has gone up roughly, I believe, 6% over the last 5 years, where Medicare conversion factor has increased less than 1%. So there's not only fair market value issues, but there's economic concerns as well, as Alex was kind of alluding to there. But specifically regarding the fair market value impacts, if organizations don't take into account the changes to compensation per work RVU in their compensation plans, they can have compensation resulting from these arrangements that are outside of fair market value. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes an issue, regulatory issue, where you don't necessarily want the government knocking on your door.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could definitely see that coming up, particularly in future years here as we're still working through it. But if they do go back and look and ask, hey, why were you using wrong either values or conversion factors or whatever, you're going to have to be accountable for that. So I want to bring this full circle. And again, this is something we're going to continue to talk about because it is ongoing and they are continuing to make changes or new developments are affecting it. And there's still questions out there with a lot of organizations, Alex, to your point, that have not really done anything. Or if they have, they've maybe not done everything they need to. So if we have somebody from an organization out there is trying to understand what's going on and what they need to do, and specific to their organization, understand kind of the impact of these changes. Where's one to start? It seems like there's so much complexity. There's a lot to do, or there's a lot of work that is going to be required, but it also touches a lot of different things, for instance, in a health system or private practice, whatever it may be. So where do they start?
They need to do an impact analysis and understand what these new wRVUs are going to mean for their organization from a reimbursement perspective, as well as a compensation perspective, if they don't make changes. And so we have been spending the past year plus working with organizations for doing these impact analysis, getting the CPT data, calculating the wRVU percentage change, understanding what the existing model variables are, meaning the rates per wRVU, what's that going to do to physician comp, and advising on how they can think about incorporating changes. What we've seen a mixed bag of is that some organizations have just wanted to incorporate these changes and try to revalue the rates per wRVU and keep their model structure intact. Whereas other organizations have used this as an opportunity to, hey, we have not looked at our physician compensation model in some time. We may need to make structural tweaks. Are we contemporary with the market? And is this a good opportunity to incorporate some of those structural tweaks? And I think what you'll find is that tweaking the structure of a physician compensation model is something that most organizations want to avoid or not do very often, because it's just so sensitive. I mean, it's just so close to home. You're touching someone's pocketbook. And so how often do you do this? You don't want to do it more than you have to. And so maybe this is an opportunity to, hey, we're going to make this change once. We don't want to have to revisit the structure at a later point in time. Let's go ahead and look at some of the tweaks we need to make to ensure that we're being contemporary with the market as far as how other reimbursement dynamics are considered, how other physicians are compensated, in different geographic locales, whatever the circumstances dictate.
Yeah. Well, and then getting back to Matt's point, as far as the potential regulatory issues, there's also that piece and kind of understanding not only the risk of not doing this, but what it's going to take to get up to compliance standards, and ultimately ensure that you're within the appropriate boundaries, because like we said, that's not something any organization out there wants to have to deal with in the next few years or at any point. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, I'll give one last plug for the payment calculator or the impact calculator on our website. You guys, Matt and Alex, put a lot of effort into developing that, and it's been updated with the latest numbers and figures. And so I think that's a great place for people to start, just to get a baseline understanding of things. And then, like you said, jumping into kind of a deeper impact analysis process, I think is something that's made a lot of sense for a lot of our clients. And I think that's a natural next step. And people can always reach out to you guys directly to answer any questions people may have and to get a better understanding of what that impact analysis looks like. So with that, we'll call it there. But again, this is going to be something that we continue to talk about and provide updates on as it is ongoing. So I just encourage folks to tune in, follow us on our content and social media, subscribe to podcasts or our email list so you can get regular updates on this and everything that we're kind of monitoring and covering going on out there in the marketplace. And then again, feel free to reach out to Matt and Alex with any direct questions. Other than that, I appreciate you guys talking about this for a few minutes, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion in future episodes.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be on.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.